Hey, I hope everyone can hear us out there. My name is Ashley. I'm with DeepCrawl, and I've got John Mueller, and we are going to be kicking off a very casual, fun end of the year question and answer session about what we can expect to see in 2019. Um, yeah, a few housekeeping items. This will be recorded, so if you have to hop off, don't feel sad. Just don't tell me you abandoned me on Twitter. We'll be sending the recording out to everyone. There will be a quick survey at the end. If you guys can fill it out, that'd be great, so we know what content to bring you more of in the next year. And then we're going on holiday. So the webinar will be back in January, but otherwise, this is the last you'll hear of DeepCrawl for a few weeks. So it'll be quiet and focused on the holiday fun. All right. John, how you feeling?
Pretty good. Thanks
Pretty
for having
good.
me, Ashley.
I'm such a nervous talker. My hands are sweaty already. All right. So I'm just going to kick it off with a few open calls or a few open questions about 2019 and where we want to go and what you want to talk about. And then we'll get into some specific questions that we had asked in advance. So the first one is something I'm really curious about, but what topics do you like to talk most about?
What topics I like to talk most about? That's I don't know, hard question. Personally, I like a lot of the technical topics, primarily because it's often something that you can easily test to see if it's working or if it's not working. Whereas a lot of the more, I guess, the soft or the quality topics, they're always a bit tricky and very subjective in that you can't really say, are you doing it right or are you doing it wrong?
Yeah. So sticking to black and white, I like that. For 2019, what do you/Google, you can take responsibility for this if you want, but what do you want SEOs to focus more on as individuals, either in terms of learning new skills or what you want them to just focus on in terms of optimizing sites, asking questions, working with clients, etc.?
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of topics that we're looking at as kind of themes for next year to focus on our side. And so I don't know, from our side, it's mostly around mobile first indexing. That's a big thing that's going to continue happening. Everything around structured data, the different ways that you can implement structured data, the ways you can test this, all of that. Things around modern websites, JavaScript-based websites, and everything around Search Console, because Search Console is doing the big revamp, and that's going to take a lot of our time. I think from what I'd like to see from the SEOs a bit more is really working together with more developers. In particular, for modern JavaScript-based websites, that's going to be a topic that's going to continue to grow. And a lot of these front-end developers, they're used to working with static HTML websites where you just finish the code, and then it's kind of ready from an SEO point of view. And then someone comes along and adds some meta tags and some fancy stuff as well. But with all of the JavaScript-based websites, that's not really the same thing anymore. So it's really important that as an SEO, you go out and you talk with these developers and you explain things to them. And you find ways to explain it in a way that makes sense, that's kind of logical, that's correct, that's easy for them to follow up on, so that they don't leave those discussions and say, oh, these SEOs and their voodoo magic. It's like there's nothing behind it all. They just want us to do this crazy thing for no particular reason. Like, should we do it or should we just ignore them? Whereas if you go and talk to them and you can explain what is happening and why you want them to do something, then that makes it much more possible for them to say, OK, by default, we'll just go down this route because that makes sense. And that makes your lives easier as well.
Yeah, it does. I mean, setting aside that SEOs are generally the worst, or just me, but it just seems like there's a lot of tension between that relationship between developers and SEOs that I would love to see break down and get a little more friendly. And I think it's tricky. I think where I have found success is being able to use tools to test, to show developers what's going on rather than me just telling them. But we've talked about it internally, and we're pushing to make sure that anyone who's giving clients SEO advice also needs to learn JavaScript, even from a basic level. Don't need to write a website, but I feel like they should use it as one of your homework items for when you're trying to strategically avoid specific relatives over the holidays. There are some good courses out there, but that's a takeaway that I've seen from all the different conversations that Google's been having and in the market is we need to learn JavaScript. We need to figure it out. Pick your platform, but start figuring out the basics of the language.
Yeah. I don't know if you need to learn JavaScript, but I think it's really important that you can talk their language. That when they bring a website to you and say this is kind of like what we want to launch, that you can talk to them in a way that they understand what you mean and they can act on what you mean. Whereas if you go in there and like say, oh, this needs more pop and more SEO and like add some link juice into it, and you're like these SEOs, I can't work with them. I'm sorry, Ashley.
I know, I know. I was hoping to avoid the LJ word and we got to 9 minutes. So way to go, John. Way to break my heart. Um, yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think that we can also be useful in advocating for developers and what they need and not just helping them give us what we need too. So I'm looking forward to that. I know I get a little naively optimistic and huggy feely, but I think that's going to be a great collaboration for 2018. All right, I'm going to jump into some specific questions. Ooh, one more. What do you want webmasters to focus less on? Do you have any opinions about that for 2019?
What should they focus less on? I don't know. That's hard to say because a lot of the SEO kind of industry is so widespread that people do all kinds of things, and especially if you have a larger website, it makes sense to focus on all of these small details as well. So it's not that I could go in there and like say, oh, you should focus less on links because then suddenly people will make a website that doesn't have any internal links, which like that doesn't work either. So it's really hard to say what they should focus less on. For the most part, I think the SEO industry is doing things really well. I really love the focus on more tools that let you crawl your website. I guess kind of like deep crawl, not trying to call that out, but I mean there are other tools out there as well.
Yeah.
But kind of the way that you can use technical tools on your side to understand how search engines would look at your website as well, without going off and doing like really crazy stuff.
Yeah, I think it's helped me personally. Before I used to always take a sample of different page templates, which would give me some decent data, but just the way tools have evolved and how I've learned how to use them personally, it opens up things I never would have been able to find before. Um, so that's been pretty exciting. All the data. Give us access to all the data. We love it. Okay, so this one's a little sticky, but you take a lot of flack for communicating to webmasters. And I know that personally I've struggled a little bit with some of the written guidelines and documentation around best practices, especially as they evolve. So do you have any personal goals for communicating to webmasters in 2019? Will things shift a little bit or is it business as usual?
I think for a large part it's headed in a similar direction. What we're trying to do is bring out more communications, more things from our side. What we're hoping to do is more around video content as well, so that we have kind of the short answer series a little bit back on track, that we have some topical video series as well. But essentially, the goal is not to communicate less so that people can complain less, but to communicate more and make it so that like more people who have these weird specific questions, they get some kind of answer.
That's awesome. Do you have a plan to send some sort of gift basket or large sum of money to AdSense to get their recommendations to align a little bit better with search? Glenn Gabe asked that question. I blame him.
I have no idea. Like I don't know about the AdSense guidelines and how they do or do not align with the search. That would be the first time I hear that their guidelines are not really aligning with our guidelines. But
yeah.
I don't know what's happening on the AdSense side. So in general, we have a fairly strict separation between the search and the ad side to make sure that search is really as neutral as possible. So especially internally, what we sometimes see is someone from the ads team will say, oh, one of my biggest customers has this problem in search, and like, can you help them? Or like, sorry, go to the Webmaster Hub forum, go post there, go ask us in the Hangout perhaps. But we can't give you any preferential advice there. So for a large part, there's really this weird separation in that sometimes the people working on the ad side, they just have to look at the external information that we put out as well. And the same applies for any product within Google where they're saying, I want to be visible in search. We point them to the public documentation. So it's not that there's any secret background channel there.
Special treatment for those who spend money. Good. Let's knock that conspiracy off the table. So we had a couple of folks create Twitter accounts from scratch to ask questions. So I wish I had more background. But one of them I really liked, which is, what are the 3 most commonly overlooked areas of SEO? I know that fits a little bit more into focus more on, but I have opinions specifically on this for internal linking and canonicalization. I know that they're basics, but when they go awry, I think they can go awry in a pretty big way. So I wanted to get your opinion on, what do people overlook as important?
I think if you have kind of one of the normal modern CMSs like WordPress or any of the other platforms, then for a large part you have the basics of SEO kind of covered, in that you have internal linking, you have kind of this structure between the pages, you can categorize pages fairly quickly, you have your titles, you have headings on pages. Maybe you use an SEO plugin to kind of tweak things a little bit, but that's easily done. What I quite often see when I do site clinics at conferences is that websites will be really nice to look at, but it's really hard for us to tell what they're actually trying to sell. So you can tell they spent a lot of money, they got a designer to make something that looks really fancy and really nice, but from a search point of view, kind of the basics are missing. It's like, what do you want to rank for? Where is that on these pages? Like, where is this actual content that you want to rank for? And it's not a matter of like how many times you repeat the keyword on a page. It's more like, maybe you should put some specific keywords on this page at all. Because then, then people will recognize, like, are you selling a service, or are you selling a product, or you're selling a book, or what? And that, I think, is one of the biggest SEO issues that I see regularly. They'll have a website that's technically okay, but it just doesn't have the content that matches what they're trying to rank for, and that is kind of trying to rank for reasonable things, where you're not like, I want to rank for online bookstore and you sell 3 books. It's like, that's not going to happen. But like you understand what the market is and where your website fits in there.
Yeah. Definitely, I've seen that with a lot of architecture sites. They have beautiful pictures and contact pages, but from a text perspective, have no idea what they do. So the marketing is great, the imagery is great, but they just are getting a little too clever. So starting out with something like what we offer, you have this problem and we can solve it, somewhere on the homepage would be a good idea. Good.
Yeah.
Let's see. So I have a question about duplicate content, and Dana Tan wrote in, and I really like the way that she worded it. So we know that there's no duplicate content penalty or filter, but a lot of folks have reported, again, correlation, maybe not causative, but when they go ahead and trim out duplicate pages, even ones that were canonicalized properly, they saw a bit of a boost in their visibility overall. Do you know why that is, or do you have any indication? Is that something, because I think a lot of people manage dupe content with canonical tags first because they're easy, but is there a benefit to actually removing those pages?
I think if they're actual duplicates, then in general, canonical tags should kind of work. The main thing there is, on the one hand, if it's not really duplicate content, then that's kind of tricky. If it's kind of similar content, then it might be that we assume the canonical tag is incorrectly set, and then we'll index those pages separately. So that's something that's really common. Otherwise, with the canonical tag, what will happen is we still have to crawl and index that page initially so that we can pick up the canonical and then focus on the canonical that you give us if we agree that that's the right one to focus on. So from a crawling point of view, it's still not optimal. But for most websites, if we crawl a little bit more or a little bit less, that doesn't change anything with regards to the ranking. So we can pick up their content, and we don't have to crawl each page 100 times. If we have it indexed, we can rank it. It's not a matter of us like optimizing crawl at that point.
Yeah.
So I think for most sites, it doesn't really matter if you have a really big site, if you have an e-commerce site with millions and millions of products, then obviously, like if you're messing up with these canonicals and you're creating all these duplicate pages, that can affect how we pick up new content. But for smaller sites, it's usually not a problem.
Makes sense. I want to ask about discrepancies in the tool in a way that I'm sure drives you bananas a bit too, and see if there are plans to address it next year. So in GSC specifically, calculating visitors can be a little sticky because they leave out rare queries. But also, the differences in the URL inspection tool versus fetch and render are the two different structured data tools. Do you experience those challenges internally? Do you know if there is a way or if there are plans to reconcile that and get better single data sources for 2019?
Yeah, I run across that as well. It's always tricky, and it really depends on the details there. Some of these tools kind of by design have different data. So kind of as an extreme case, looking at Search Console versus Google Analytics, you might see the same traffic from search in both, but the numbers will be very different. That's just because from a kind of systematic point of view, they track something completely different. And that's something that does happen across some of the other tools as well, where we have, for example, the structured data tool, which tests structured data in general, and then the rich results tool, which focuses on specific types of rich results, kind of with the Google glasses on, like, is this valid for Google's point of view? So those differences are a bit more tricky. That's something where I do wish we could focus on that a little bit more to make that a little bit easier. For the most part, at the moment, it essentially means you have to understand what these tools do, and you have to be able to interpret the results. And if someone comes to you and says, like, this tool says this, you as the expert have to be able to say, okay, that means that this and this and this might be a problem, or it just might mean that, well, actually this tool flags this, but it doesn't actually have any influence on your website at all.
Got it. Yeah, I've come across that specifically in the fetch and render versus the URL inspection tool, because fetch and render feels like it just grabs a snapshot in time. Whereas if I have it correctly, the URL inspection tool is really marrying that snapshot data with what's going on in the index. So we're getting a deeper result in terms of relevance.
Yeah, I would expect some of these tools to merge a little bit over time, because as the Search Console kind of functionality is migrating to the new system, that's something where they can take a look at the existing tools and say, oh, well, this was a bit messy with the old setup. With the new one, we can combine it into something more unified.
Do you know of any reports from the old console that aren't going to make the cut for the new console? Like, don't take away my favorite parameter report.
I don't know. I don't know offhand. So those are still discussions that are ongoing. We need to figure out exactly how to move everything over, and to figure out which ones don't make that much sense in the new Search Console. One of the ones, I don't know what the team has decided on this yet, but one of the ones that always feels a little bit weird is the preferred domain setting, where you specify www or non-www. Yeah. It feels like something like there should be a better way to let Google know about what you prefer.
Yeah, that one's a bit clumsy. That, I think, is one of my biggest sources of frustration, plus the limits on the 1,000 samples, which can be, it can really show me some issues depending on site size, but it can be extremely limiting. And I know that, or I've heard that the API will be a focus for 2019 after new Search Console potentially, so not first priority. But tell me about the new API, or what do you think is going to improve, or what access to data we'll have? Because that really excites us over at DeepCrawl. All the things is the answer, just all of it.
Yeah, I don't know. So I think prioritizing an API is always tricky. I don't know exactly what the plans are there. It's one of those things where we want to make sure that we can give enough access to data so that people can use their own tools and kind of work together with a unified set of data. But it's always a bit tricky to kind of get that prioritized properly. So I don't know what the next things are that will happen there. I do know we use the API for the WordPress plugin that we just announced. I don't think it's out yet. But yeah, you can sign up if you have WordPress. I think that'll be pretty neat. We use the API there. So if there are things that people want in the WordPress plugin there that rely on some API functionality, then at least there'll also be kind of an internal push for more functionality in the API as well.
Yeah, Sitekit is really cool. For any of those who haven't heard of it, it's in beta now. You can go request access, but it brings some of that top-level Search Console data right to where webmasters are in WordPress. And for a lot of folks in this webinar, maybe it's not as sexy because they're elbow deep in data all the time. But I think for a lot of webmasters, it pulls that barrier away of trying to understand that data, and that integration is super useful. Are there plans for more integrations with more tools moving forward, or is WordPress the golden child?
I'm sure there'll be more. I'm sure there'll be more. So the idea is really kind of like you mentioned to bring this data more to where people are creating content. And I think the webmaster persona as such is a bit tricky because nobody really calls themselves webmaster anymore. I went to a conference recently and asked like who here is an SEO or digital marketer and like who's a webmaster, and it was like silence. So it's one of those things where we kind of built up this persona also with webmaster tools to help them get them information, but actually they're doing things differently nowadays. And there are people who focus just on SEO, and people who work on the content, and people who don't even know anything about Search Console. And giving them at least some information about what's happening in search, I think that makes sense. So if they're in, I don't know, WordPress or some of the other CMSs, I think it makes sense to make it easier for them to get access to this data.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. But I'm a little ticked that I have to order a new desk placard now. No longer a webmaster. Days of yore. Evolution here. All right, so I have a favorite new report in the new GSC, which is the URL inspection tool. I love it. I don't love that it's one-off, just because the data is so exciting. And one of the pieces of data that I think is super relevant and helpful are the canonicals, and if it's biting by user-declared canonicals. How important is that to Google? And do you see potentially getting a dashboard of data where then I can run and see, what pages or page templates are having canonical issues or don't have canonical signals?
I don't know. So I think at the moment the focus is more on moving the existing functionality to the new Search Console. So I suspect they wouldn't build something completely new just yet. I think having this kind of feedback is always useful, and having it ahead of time is really useful because they have to make their plans somehow. Yeah. So that's kind of the one side. On the other hand, I'm always a bit torn around canonicalization because it is something that makes sense for a site owner to kind of know about. But for the most part, it's something where if we pick a different URL as canonical, it'll rank exactly the same. So it's more that from a tracking point of view, you can look at that exact URL that you want to have indexed, and you can see what's happening with that. Yeah. But from a practical point of view, it's like if you have a normal small website, it doesn't matter if Google picks a different canonical or not. So if we had a report that said like, oh, Google picked a different canonical for these 500 URLs, you should go and fix that. It's like, what should you fix? Should you set the canonical to what Google decided? I mean, it wouldn't change anything. Right? It's kind of one of those tricky things where I think some people would be able to take this information and say, oh, this means my site architecture is set up wrong. My internal linking isn't optimal. And like that's
Yeah.
probably the case. But for most websites, it doesn't really matter if we pick a different URL as canonical.
Okay. I think that's useful. I think that's where I have personally where I see a lot of SEOs go with it is looking at internal linking specifically, because we know that a canonical tag is really just a soft signal. It's like, hey, I prefer this, but also I'm mix matching all my links and I've named URLs different things. But it feels like a loaded gun, potentially like the 404 report, which still multiple times a week I see, people freaking out and trying to clear that dashboard when really that's not necessary in most cases.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly. I think the general focus on finding actual issues that are causing problems with the website, that's kind of the direction we'd like to go with Search Console. So less from, it's like, here is 5 million things that we found on your website. You'll never believe number 7. And more towards like, actually, you did this one mistake last week, and now half of your site is disappearing from search. That's something you might really want to fix.
So less about a raw data table and more about pulling a step forward with a little bit of analysis or grouping templates to just say act here.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. It feels more actionable, but I imagine it's a little tricky too. And some of us are just going to
Yeah.
love that data table anyway.
That I think is part of the difficulty in that there are lots of technical SEOs who are like, I just want all of the raw data and I'll figure it out myself.
Curmudgeons. I love them. Okay, while we're making requests, holiday requests for new things in the tools, add on that list, or at least I'll ask here, but will GSC ever see more information on rich results? So when you see stuff coming through in carousels or something beyond rich snippets, but those like carousels or videos or anything in the SERPs, will we be able to get any indication of how often that's happening for our sites?
I could imagine that happening. Yeah. That's definitely one of the areas where we think it's less critical that we should like hide that data somehow, and it's more a matter of making it so that it's actually useful for people. So that specifically with the Search Analytics report, where you can filter down with some of the results type, I think it would make sense there, but it's also something where if suddenly you wouldn't be able to filter down like by rich result type, but rather it's like, I don't know, book carousel, for example, then you're like, it's a book carousel, like what do I have to do to get one? All of these kind of additional features. And it makes it a lot harder to get a better overview of what is actually happening with your website and which ways is it being shown. So kind of that balance between giving granular information that's useful for people and not overloading them with things that they don't really need to kind of worry about in detail. Because a lot of these rich results types, they change over time. And then suddenly this carousel disappears because we decided it doesn't make sense for users because we should switch to a different type of carousel. Then suddenly everyone's like, oh, it's like everything changed for my website, and they don't realize actually just shift from this type to that type, and it's all the same.
Yeah. Do you think the same applies to voice queries? Because I know everyone wants to see how they're doing in voice, but pretty difficult to use that data. I mean, I could always use that to see sort of the speakable attributes and how language is reflected on my site or what people are using to ask for my site. But I've also heard it said that it's applicable to only a narrow group of people, and there's not a lot you can do with that.
I don't know. You have a Google Home, right? Do you do voice queries? Do you do voice queries?
Yeah. So we have a couple Google Homes in the house. I haven't used it as efficiently as I probably should. We listen to a lot of music. I really love the Google Home app because I can get transcripts of what my kids ask, which is terrifying and enlightening. But it's just become fun for our family more than it's looking for specific sites and information. In fact, I've actually been disappointed when my kids are asking specific information, like how long is the loop of Henle and kidneys for the human? Like the sites that it returns sometimes is pretty tricky. We're big into anatomy this week.
Okay.
But I will
say, I think that's kind of the tricky part there as well, because lots of people use voice, but it's still at a point where it's like getting the right results from the web is still kind of tricky. So I don't know how much useful data we would have for sites. Specifically, like, show me how many voice queries triggered my site, and we like 2. And you're like,
2 ever. Good luck. Yeah, we use it more for actions in our family. So the integrations with different apps that may take us 3 or 4 clicks, I think, is super useful. And this is where I get to always plug that Spotify has a 1-hour playlist of fart sounds that my kids found. So that is the benefit of Google Home in our house. God bless you, Spotify.
okay.
Yeah, we're terrible. So you already answered a little bit of this, but I had a few people asking about structured data and focusing on that. A lot of it was really how to position that focusing and how to build it in with other elements that might, air quote, move the needle a little bit more. But I'd also like to look at that. Plus, what do you think structured data is going to look like in 2019? Is it going to be an expansion of specific attributes, or could we look at using it in different ways? I mean, what's coming?
What's coming? I think it's hard to say because partially the structured data is used for specific search features, and it's hard to say which search features will be coming. So that's kind of the one thing there. The other side is that we also use structured data to better understand sites in general, to understand what these pages are about. So even if we don't use it for specific search features, it's sometimes helpful to have that structured data on these pages. So that's something that we'll try to figure out as well over the year, how we can best communicate that. Because I think it makes sense for some sites to add a little bit of information in structured data, even if it's not shown directly. But at the same time, there's so many different types of structured data out there that you could spend all day adding markup to your pages, and that wouldn't help anyone. So finding that balance between, like, add some structured data based on the primary information that you want to bring across, but don't go overboard because you probably won't have any return on investment on all of that time that you spent there.
So focus on adding those core supportable elements that I imagine show up well in search and help people understand pages, but could also potentially help with accessibility and other tools that are helping certain types of users crawl sites. Correct?
Yeah. I think one of the things with structured data that has come up for me every now and then is everything around images, in that some of the search features require images in slightly different formats or sizes, and that can be tricky. So if you kind of want to prepare for structured data features that might be using your content and you have a lot of imagery on your site, then I just make sure that you have that available in different formats and different sizes, so that if something comes out and says, like, oh, I need 4:3 aspect ratio with this many pixels for your recipe, then that's something where you can say, OK, I can just pop that in. I have that already. It's not that I need to set up a separate pipeline, like, oh, I need to reprocess all of the millions of images I have on my site and do that all manually. But if you have a plugin that does that for you, or some server-side script, that makes it a lot easier.
Oh, that's a good idea. So question about images, though, because when you use product markup, they want you to link to a high-quality version of an image. Would you use one that's truly high resolution that might be a little heavier, or one that's optimized for the web that might be slightly lower resolution but loads a lot faster?
I don't know where specifically that would get used within the product markup area. So that I think kind of depends there, but you definitely don't need to go overboard. So it's not that you need to have like a 50 megapixel image of every product that you have, because like we would never be able to show that resolution image anyway. Yeah. So it's something that's kind of maxed out at what a normal user would see.
Okay, so reasonable but optimized for speed.
Yeah.
Google and their reasonable requests. Really difficult. Fantastic. Going back to voice a little bit, the speakable attribute is really interesting to me, and I fiddled around with it a little bit more, but it's my understanding that it's not supported globally. Is that true, or is there plans to roll that out globally? And just in general, where can I get information about how Google rolls out certain features across the world? We've got a lot of people tuning in from Europe and the US right now, but a lot of people from other countries too.
I think that's always tricky. A lot of these features roll out in the US and in English first because that's easiest for the teams to kind of analyze what is happening. And usually what happens is we try to see how it works out. Maybe we need to fine tune some things, and then over time we roll it out in other countries and other languages. Sometimes it's a bit tricky in that it depends a little bit on policies and local laws and all of those things, which makes things a lot harder than they need to be. Or rather, they're just harder. I mean, like, you can't really argue about laws like they are what they are. But that's one aspect that sometimes plays into that. And sometimes it's also a problem of being able to analyze the data quality. So especially if we're highlighting something in search, we need to be sure that this is kind of reasonable content and not that like you marked it up as a job and actually it's a link to a casino website and it's just in some language that we don't understand that well. And we think, oh, this is like fantastic job, and it's just an affiliate link to some casino website. That's kind of the balance that we're trying to find there. So that's I think we've talked a bit about providing more information on what's available in which country from the search feature point of view, from a structured data point of view, because you don't want to implement all of this structured data and then suddenly in the end you realize, oh, actually it's not even shown in my country. Like, why did I bother doing all of this? Yeah. But that's sometimes, on the one hand, it's kind of chicken and egg problem where we would like to roll it out in other countries, and if nobody's implementing it in those countries, we wouldn't have anything to show, so we wouldn't roll it out. So we're trying to encourage people to add this markup, even if we're not showing it yet. Usually they can see based off of how we show it in the US, like, is it worthwhile? Does it work for my website or not? And based on that, they can work out, I'll kind of take this bet and like, it's not available yet, but when it is available and it looks like it's kind of unproblematic, then my website will be available from the start for that. That's kind of the one thing. We do want to add a little bit more information on that to the developer docs, though, to make it easier for you to recognize, is this global or is this not global? Tracking which country, which region things are available in is really tricky because these things change over time, and sometimes we don't realize that until a little bit later. But we'll try to kind of add at least an attribute where it's like, this is global or this is not global.
I think that'd be super useful, because that's a tricky thing. And I'd want to marry that data with what I'm seeing with other data sets, just because, you know, it can affect the users that we're getting under the visibility. It'd be nice to know why. But yeah, wish lists. We're getting a pretty long wish list here. Okay, I have another question about voice, and then I swear I'll leave it be, but this was a hot topic when people are sending me questions, is how do you think SEOs should go about talking with their clients about voice? A lot of clients are coming pretty aggressively and saying, hey, I heard of a thing, it's shiny, I want the thing. You know, and I know the way that I approach it is usually like it can be pretty expensive to explore, so you need to have a very specific use case. How would you want other SEOs to talk about it?
I think it is still fairly new. Kind of like how you experience it with your own use of these devices. It is something that these devices are more and more popular, but it's still something very new in that it's kind of rare that people go to the device and like ask something where they would like to have a search result and they would like to have that search result read to them. I think there's some direction that's kind of going, or some things that are kind of going in that direction a little bit more. Things like the Q&A markup that we recently launched, where we can kind of more clearly recognize, oh, there's a question on this page and there's an answer here. And that might be something that we could say, well, you know, questions and answers, like people ask questions and we can provide them an answer based on your website and point at your website and say, well, based on this fantastic website, this is the answer. So I think for websites that do have this kind of question answer content, that might be a direction to look into. But in general, I wouldn't say that every website has to focus on voice and do something specific for voice. Because it's kind of unclear what will actually stick.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I'm going to shift again to a topic that I'm usually uncomfortable with, and I think primarily it's because I haven't done as much work in it, so I may not understand the nuances. And I've mostly seen sort of the bad side, which is unfair. But I want to talk about links. We had a really great question from Dana Tan. I'm just going to read it here. So, link builder specialist Judith Lewis recently stated that the value of inbound links depreciate relatively fast with time. According to Judith, after 6 to 8 months, a link loses close to 100% of its air quote PR value. Is this correct, or can you comment on this trend?
Okay, links.
Links.
I won't talk about. Oh, I can't. Wow. Okay. No, but I think what is kind of happening here is probably that if you work on creating links to your website, a lot of times you'll end up with links that are tied to something that's kind of tied to a point in time. So for example, if you work on creating content on your website, that's fantastic, and you reach out to news websites, and they're like, oh, this is fantastic, we'll write about it. Then there'll be some news article about your website, maybe with a link to your website if you're lucky, if that all works out. And that drives traffic to your website. That's all fantastic. But like news articles come and go, and like more and more news articles come over time. So if that is the link that you've been focusing on and the link that you kind of got there, then over time that news article is going to disappear more or less. It's like it's going to become less and less relevant over time, and essentially the value of that link will also decrease because it's like, well, this article is now in the archive somewhere, like hidden in the cellar in some drawer that's unmarked. And obviously Googlebot might still find it, but it's not going to be as useful as a link, like someone recommending your website, saying it's like in front and center on that page at the moment. So I suspect that's kind of the direction that she's headed there. But it's not the case that by default any link that is out there on the web is like useless over a certain period of time. It's more that, well, this particular link, because it's on something that's tied to this point in time, that just gets drowned out by all of the other new information that's out there.
Okay. There were a lot of other questions about links that we might follow up with offline, but I'll leave them where they are for now. I want to talk again about something that I have a little bit of experience with but don't know a lot from, so be educating me here too. But I want to talk a bit about local search. I know some amazing folks that do great work in local, but a lot of it's over my head. So I'm going to ask a couple basic questions as a user. We know that we've asked, Google said, you don't really need to use near me or put the location always in the H1 or handle multiple cities by cookie cutter pages. How do you recommend today and moving into 2019 people really target when they have a service that's offered in different cities? What's the most elegant way and effective way of doing that?
I don't know. I probably need to think about that a bit before having kind of this like off the cuff of my hand answer there. I think to some extent having information about the locations on the pages, that definitely matters. Mm-hmm. My off-the-hand recommendation would also be to make sure that you have your appropriate Google Local listing so that we can show it within Google Local, or what's it, Google My Business now, mm-hmm. And that we can show it from there. I think having something like just randomly placing near me within your title, that feels kind of awkward because there's like someone in Timbuktu is searching about, I don't know, pizzeria near me, and it's like your website is unlikely going to rank there. And even if it does rank, it's like what are these people going to do?
Yeah.
They're not going to make it to your pizzeria. So that's something where I think probably for a certain period of time that worked fairly well, and that our algorithms were like, oh, keyword matching, this fits really well. Mm-hmm. But I don't know from a practical point of view if that really made that much sense. But I honestly don't have that much experience with the local side.
Okay, we won't open the can of worms from that side. I will say from my side, the Google My Business Portal has been a lot more helpful than it was historically. I know it has its nuances, but I've also noticed that there are updates often and new categories added that I am not aware of. So the way that I found to make the best use of it is just to log in regularly and make sure it's proactively managed. Um,
I
yeah.
have no idea. I would probably refer to whoever's asking this question because it sounds like they know what they're talking about.
Oh man, and there are some good ones. You guys bug me if you need local specialists because there are some smart folks out there and it's all over my head. So on a broader targeting, so for international, this is one that I've struggled with. From what I understand, the Google recommendation is basically don't do IP redirects, but just give people the option. Maybe it's like a little JavaScript flag or an HTML toast or something that gives them the opportunity to say, hey, I think you're in France. Would you like to go to a French site? A lot of other big companies are using the redirects, so we sort of see them as positive examples in a lot of ways, like Apple, for example. And a lot of companies have restrictions, potentially legal restrictions, where they're required, like FDA restrictions for different sorts of health products, where they're required to redirect people. In that case, is it best to whitelist Google so they don't get redirected anywhere or treat them like a regular user from the US? And follow up, is there going to be a more elegant or flexible way to handle those use cases in the future?
I don't know about the future, so don't have that answer. But
Why are you here? This is 2019.
yeah, I don't know. So uh, in practice, we do recommend treating Googlebot the same as a user from the same region. So if, for example, you're redirecting all users from the US and we're crawling from the US, then you should really redirect Googlebot as well. I think there's some categories of sites which have less of a problem with that and some that have more of a problem. So if you're based in the US and we crawl from the US, then it's like nothing can really go wrong because like we redirect to the US site and we pick that up. In the worst case, what can happen is we wouldn't be able to pick up the local copies. So that's something where you kind of notice it, but it's not, for the most part, probably not that critical in that maybe your French content is just isn't ranking because it's not actually indexed and like you notice that it's okay. But for example, if you're based in Europe and for some reason you have to block the US and we crawl from the US, then suddenly all of your content is gone. And that's more of a trickier situation because then you really have to think about, OK, so what content could I make available for users in the US so that Google can at least index some basic version of that content?
Yeah.
And that's sometimes a bit tricky, and that kind of goes into legal and policy questions where you have to figure it out with your lawyers to see like what amount of information can we provide that is generic enough that would be legal in the US or would be allowed in the US from whatever policies that you have within your country or within your company, and would still provide enough value that when people are searching for your content, they'd be able to find that. So that balance is sometimes really, really tricky to find. Again, for sites in the US, usually that's less of a problem because if you block all of Switzerland because like they're all jerks in Switzerland, then Googlebot would never even notice. It's like, who cares? Like Google would be fine. Your site would rank exactly the same as always. Whereas if you decided to block people in California because you think like they're all eating avocado toast and they don't deserve my awesome content,
Fair.
then maybe suddenly your website would not be indexed at all. So that's a bit more of a problem.
Yeah, that sounds tricky. Um, All right. So for specific questions on internationalization, I always recommend folks go and ask in the Webmaster Help Forum, which I get a lot of good answers from. But I'm going to use this as a point to just say we got a lot of specific questions about individual websites that we can't address on the call. So go to Google Webmaster Help Forums to get answers there. I didn't want to ignore anyone, but those were just ones that we're tight on time for. I know that we're getting short on time. We might stay a couple minutes after. We had some questions queued up that we won't be able to ask that we might be able to address and tack on for the recap that'll be published on DeepCrawl and shared far and wide. So stay tuned for that, but I'll try to get a few more good ones here. I have some questions about JavaScript. Of course, shout out to Martin there, but What's the average time that JavaScript is cached in Google's system?
There is no fixed time.
Okay. Um, Question about dynamic content. So if I'm an e-com site and I'm changing prices a lot, I know that I want to dynamically serve that and it refreshes every time there's a visit. Does that include bots hitting that page, or is that only non-bot traffic that'll refresh the price?
That's totally up to you. So, I mean, we would only see that if search engines see that different price
Okay.
as well. But essentially, how you handle that on your side is totally up to you.
Okay. Now that we know, or now that we know, now, I mean, modern sites are making heavy use of JavaScript, and page speed is pretty strict on those render blocking JavaScripts or flagging certain modules or external scripts. Do you see some of those guidelines changing in 2019 to accommodate more JavaScript and mobile layouts?
I do see those guidelines kind of evolving over time. I'm not sure exactly what will happen there, but that should be changing. I imagine just changing naturally over time as well.
Yeah. I'm going rapid fire now. Are last modified heads or headers still taken into consideration when Google bot decides to recrawl content?
Yes.
Cool. Fast again. Previously, I know that Google was just using HTTP 1.1 to crawl, but does Googlebot now support HTTP 2 for crawling?
I don't think so. I don't
Okay.
think so. But that is something that pops up every now and then. I think from a practical point of view, it doesn't make any difference for search for sites because we crawl in a way that's different from a normal browser. But I imagine that'll appear at some point in the future.
Okay. On a scale of 1 to 10, because you love ranges and stickler for numbers here, how important for SEO is analyzing log files? It
I would say
depends.
it depends on your website. So small sites, probably not so much. If you have a really big website where you need to make sure that crawling works out well, then yes, you should look at that.
Yeah. And there are lots of tools. I'm just going to plug this. I mean, we integrate with a couple at DeepCrawl, but there are so many great options out there for downloading the data and analyzing it in a way that's friendly. I feel like server logs were something that were a little scary for most folks doing SEO, but it's getting a lot better. So that's another, if you haven't been diving into it, if anyone's curious, I can share resources that I found easy for even me to understand, not having a very technical background. So I'm happy to share those too. All right, site speed. Whew. Um, so a lot of the tools will measure load time, but runtime is something that there are a lot of questions around and how that can erode as users load the site first and then start interacting. As far as I understand, that's not really something Google can measure and rank on, but are there plans to dive a little bit deeper into that, or is that just a technical challenge we have to work with right now?
I imagine that's tricky because we don't really know what like to click on and what to do to test these things. But I suspect the strongest impact for most sites will be around the conversion, like how many pages per
Mm-hmm.
visit that people look at, if they buy things or not. That's something where if you have a really fast site with regards to interactions, then you will see that effect
Okay.
on your site.
So it's not measuring runtime as the user crawls, but the actions that can come after load time.
Yeah.
Do individual URL speed ratings affect the overall ranking of the site, or is it really a page-by-page basis?
Wait, that's the same thing.
Shit. Okay, so
You're trying to trick me.
You guys, bring some coffee over here. So for page speed ranking, is it taken page by page, or is it more of a whole site metric?
We do both. So we try to look at it overall where we can, and we also try to be as granular as possible. So if we can recognize that parts of a site are kind of unique, then we'll try to treat that a little bit differently from the rest of the site. But it is something where it makes sense to look at your site overall and kind of find those hotspots where things are slow, where people are also going fairly often, so that you can fix that.
Okay. There are a lot of tools out there, a lot of metrics to look at. If you could have webmasters who maybe aren't as savvy or who are limited on resources focus on one or two metrics, which would you recommend for improving site speed?
For improving site speed. Um, I don't know. I really like the way that web.dev integrates all of the Lighthouse tests and that tracks your site's performance over time. I think that's a really nice approach. I don't know how that will evolve over time because that's still fairly new. But I think that's a really nice place to get more information. What I also like is the webpagetest.org animation of your pages loading. So that you can really see, like, at this point in time, this is what was actually loaded for users, and that makes it very visible, like what the effect on load time means, and even the individual elements on the page where you can say, well, actually, all of the content that they need is visible already fairly quickly, and it's still loading a lot of stuff further down on the page or maybe additional information, but that's fine. It's like I focus on the primary content.
And that waterfall, nightmares. I really like it, though. It's a really effective discussion tool. I've also just found that time to first byte, if I just had to grab one metric when there's something really going awry, that's one that usually I could communicate best to the devs, because that can also be a pretty easy one to fix and start getting movement on. AMP, real quick, how do you see AMP being promoted and married with mobile in 2019?
AMP married with mobile. I think what we'll probably see is more and more sites that go in the direction of pure AMP sites, or at least parts of their site that they go pure AMP. Partially because it just makes it so much easier if you have a single URL. Kind of like with responsive web design, you have one URL instead of like your web and your MDOT. If you just have one URL and it's AMP and it's mobile and it's responsive, then you have a lot less hassle. And you have one version to maintain. You have all of your content in one version. I think that's really useful. The other direction I also see is that from the AMP side, they're moving more towards making a lot of these technologies available for normal web pages, or like legacy web pages, or whatever you want to call them, so that more and more we'll be able to treat like really well-made mobile web pages or mobile-friendly web pages similar ways that we would treat AMP pages.
Cool. Because I mean, the components are really launching. I mean, there's a ton now, and I've experienced a little bit of a roadblock with some developers wanting to use AMP, but have found some success with taking just specific AMP components and borrowing that. So there might be a case where a video player is particularly slow, or an image carousel where AMP has a component that we can take. You may not earn that little lightning bolt in SERPs, but I've found it useful for helping to knock down speed and start familiarizing the devs with the AMP components.
Yeah, I think like it's easy to look at the whole AMP framework as kind of what it is. It's a normal web framework where like you could be building something with jQuery or some other CSS layout tool. Might as well just use AMP as a framework for making websites, especially if you're starting from fresh and if you're not tied to a specific framework or a specific CMS. Then maybe that's a really simple way to say, okay, I can make fast, useful websites like that.
Cool. I have two hypotheticals to end on.
Okay.
Why not? It's fun. Let's say you're a site publisher and you only have 5 minutes of internet access and you can only access one GSC report or one tool. What are you going to look at? To monitor the health of your site, like
search
one
analytics. The performance report in the Search Console.
All right.
It's kind of tricky because like one page view, you don't see everything. You have to click around. So maybe you have to get some more internet time. But that's where I go.
Okay. You've been promoted. You're now in charge of search. Nobody can find Paul Har. What would be the first thing that you would want to change or make different in the algorithms or in just how search is represented, and why?
I'd be really egocentrical and make everyone move to Europe so that we can get rid of time zones. I
Fair.
know that's not what this guy was asking for, but that's kind of the one thing that I think would make my life so much easier. If like everyone were in the same time zone, we could just communicate a lot faster and sometimes solve the weird cases that we see on Twitter a lot faster. All of these kind of things. I don't have anything offhand where I'd say, oh, this algorithm is really broken in search and we need to
Hmm.
change it immediately. I think there are tons of really smart people working on search and doing really smart things, and there are sometimes edge cases that pop up that look really bad, but for the most part, I think they're doing really awesome stuff.
Good, good. I mean, I know that global support is really tricky, both in terms of, cultural context, languages, the time that the issues come out. I mean, that's something that the complexities, I'm sure, puts a lot of weight on your team, a lot of great opportunities, but it can be really difficult. So even though I'm not going to let you change all time zones, I think that's an interesting discussion and one lens to see what one team has to do to talk about search and to connect with webmasters worldwide. Um, Very cool. I've run a little bit over. If anyone was playing a drinking game where you took a shot every time John said it depends, you should go lay down or just drunk tweet at me because I really enjoy it. But mostly, I just want to say thank you for everyone to come out who has come out. John, thank you to you. Take the survey. Let us know what you like or what you want to see more of. Um, Happy holidays. John, you have any closing thoughts?
I just want to thank the folks at DeepCrawl who are doing such an awesome job transcribing the Webmaster Office Hours Hangouts. I really, really appreciate that. It's one of those things where we put a lot of content out there on YouTube in these office hours, and sometimes some of the interesting parts get lost.
Yeah.
So really, really thankful for all the work that you're doing to kind of transcribe that and make that more available to people.
Yeah, I will say that, our company is very focused on helping users, I think similar to the mushy humanistic sentiment of Google. So we're always looking to improve. Let us know how we can help. And that's a wrap. That wasn't so bad, right? Not even torturous.
Fantastic.
All right. Fabulous. Thank you, everyone. And I look forward to any feedback. Bye.